So good morning, A-pushers. The purpose of this video is going to take a look at topic 8.4 in post-war America. That is the economy after 1945. We're going to zero in on factors related to the economic growth immediately following World War II, and then we're going to take a look how the movement of Americans is going to figure into economic changes as well. So here we go. So the College Board lays out for us a few factors when it relates down into the economic growth in the late 1940s going to the 1950s. One of those is the burgeoning private sector. I think in all of these, not just in this one, but for everything on this, we can talk about like a World War II connection. Industry was booming during World War II for wartime production. And as there is some transition getting back to peacetime manufacturing, those businesses have still got a lot of money to spend, and because profits were high during the war. And so this is going to lead to an expansion in the development of consumer goods. So private industry is strong during this time period, kind of like unprecedented level strong. Economic growth in the United States is going to be steady for the better part of the next 2 decades, which is kind of really unusual. Usually things will get stagnant after a few years, but this is like steady, continuous growth for almost 20 years. Along those same lines, there is a general steady growth in the birth rate in the United States, and this is called the baby boom. So contrary to what people might think at first glance, the post-war baby boom is not just because Americans were celebrating that the war was over, and so there's a little quick spike in birth rates. If that was the case, the baby boom would have stopped by 1945 or 1946. But the fact that this is going to go on as a 20-year span, this is something worth paying attention to as well. This graph that's showing us the birth rate in the United States, this is kind of like showing the bulk of the 20th century. So going through the 1920s into the Great Depression, the birth rate is declining. That's got to do with some changes so far as contraception law in the 1920s. But then a little bit of an increase through the 1940s, and then this little spot in red, this is the birth rate as it goes from 1945 up until the mid 60s. And I know what you're saying. You're saying the birth rate here is declining, but it's declining back to a point that it was at the beginning of World War II. So this is a 20-year stretch where everything is there. And when it comes down to people deciding to have more children, this is really about economic comfort and economic security, and the post-war years really kind of represent that for a vast majority of Americans. As fear and as tense as Cold War issues may have been at home, there is relative economic prosperity, almost true completely across the board, definitely true when it comes down to the American middle class. Another big factor on this is going to be the amount of spending that's being made by the federal government, and some of this being spent on new technologies. So federal government intervention, we talked about this back in Great Depression, New Deal, how the federal government jobs were trying to create economic growth when times were tough. But what we're seeing here is federal spending creating jobs when times are good. So some of this has a direct connection into World War II. The passage of the GI Bill, this is the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. This is a World War II piece of legislation still on the books today in 2023, but the purpose of this is to kind of help returning soldiers, returning veterans from the war, kind of get a transition back into society, an economic transition and a social transition as well. It's going to provide, VA benefits, like medical benefits for soldiers returning home. It's going to give them opportunity for low interest home loans and give them an opportunity for education. The poster here is about educational training. This is going to be really one of the big turning points in U.S. history as far as the number of Americans that are going to go to college. Pre-World War II, the college attendance rate is much lower than it is in the 1940s and 50s, and that changes really kind of up to the GI Bill. So professional training is going to lead to a more educated, more diverse workforce, and so far as like being able to get more advancement in the workplace. But it's also going to lead to a peacetime transition. After World War One, veterans came home and there were labor strikes because you had so many workers there right away looking for work. After World War Two, because there were a certain number of veterans that were going to, well, in essence, like go to college instead of going into the workforce, there's a smoother transition that comes into play, and this is going to be kind of a big deal when it comes down to this economic growth and prosperity. Federal spending also means federal, like government jobs, and this is going to hold true in Cold War defense spending, which we have talked about in class as being part of the military industrial complex. This is something that is going to create jobs as it is going to, be a larger and larger portion of the overall American economy. By 1956, the federal construction projects are going to be huge, the biggest of which is the interstate highway system. Here in the Houston area, this would be like I-45 and I-10, even the 610 loop, even though that is really just around Houston, it's still part of what they call the interstate highway system as a way to better link different parts of the country together to strengthen the economy. It's also got a little bit of a secondary Cold War purpose as a way to move troops around the country if we need to. And there are sections of federal highways in the interstate system that are designed to be able to be used as landing strips if you have to mobilize air forces in the United States as a result of Cold War activity. Kind of like one of those Cold War fears suddenly in the background here, but there's definitely a huge economic impact of this as well. The effects of this prosperity in the 50s is going to lead to a huge 2 decades long growth in business and in farming. The family farm is going to start giving away to agricultural businesses. ConAgra, the big agricultural company in the U.S. in the 21st century, it has its origins going back to the post-World War II years. And all this manufacturing that's going on in the 1940s and 50s is going to lead to an even bigger dose of consumer culture in the United States. And on the cultural side of things, in a separate topic from the College Board, we'll kind of look at consumer culture a little bit more on that end of it. So another factor weighing into the economic changes after World War II has got to do with a movement of American people. After World War I, we were talking about the Great Migration as people were moving from the rural areas to the cities, most notably African Americans moving from the rural South to the urban North. This migration is really kind of focused in on middle class Americans, and this is happening because of rapid expansion of higher education opportunities. The ability to go to college means an ability to get more professional jobs, and this is going to lead to a higher income bracket for a whole lot of Americans. Those education opportunities are growing quickly because of the GI Bill and because of new technologies, just like we talked about on this first slide of the notes. So this movement is happening because of lots and lots of changes. So far as where this movement is happening to the suburbs. We're not quite to the point where Houston suburbs are getting huge, but up in the northern half of the country, the move to suburbia is huge on this. The interstate highway system is going, I mean, the reason the 610 loop and in northern cities, those kind of looped interstates around major urban centers, they exist because of the growth that's happening to the suburbs. Couple of notable, things to keep track of on this is the creation of what I just tend to call them Levitt towns. You can kind of get like the aerial shot of the one in that picture on the top right, and the one below is just kind of like a little neighborhood view. Almost looks like a Google Maps view, right? But these are pictures from the mid 1950s, I guess. We would call these things master planned communities with like the streets and the cul-de-sacs and trying to just sort of, create some affordable housing in suburban areas so you can commute into the big city, and it sounds kind of like Pearland. These are cities that are happening across the northern United States initially here in the 50s and then kind of expanding to the rest of the country in the late 50s going into the 60s and 70s. They're called Levitowns because it is like the businessman's name is Abraham Levitt. He is the developer that's figuring out ways to cost money upfront to kind of start this business. But when he starts buying construction materials in bulk and kind of pre-planning what the housing construction is going to look like, he's greatly reducing cost. This cost is going to kind of dovetail nicely with the GI Bill and those low interest home loans that the vets can get. And this gets to be a little bit of a symbol of the 1950s, this kind of like calm, conforming suburban lifestyle. You could buy a house in one of these Levitowns for like, in 1950s dollars, like five to $8,000, which is about 35 or 40,000. These are like pretty cheap houses, but this is a house that's going to come in the suburbs, and it's going to happen with like a front yard and a backyard, a nice little suburban, not necessarily a gated community, but a nice little suburban community that's going to sort of be isolated from some of the urban issues that are starting to be felt by more people in the 1950s. More on that in a couple of minutes, actually. So Levittown, there is a Levittown, like literally the town is called Levittown in New York. There's one in Pennsylvania, but this is a model that kind of pops up all over the country. As this comes up, it kind of like blends in with the conformist consumer culture of the 1950s, and this is going to lead to these becoming very homogenous neighborhoods, very white American neighborhoods. So much so that we need to talk about this as a way to set up, some distinctions going, taking us into the 1960s and 70s a little bit later on. I kind of take these terms in opposite order of what they're listed here. White flight is kind of a late 60s, early 70s term for this white American movement to the suburbs. Because what you're seeing is white middle class, well, you're seeing middle class Americans move to the suburbs, but because of economic disparities and some inequalities in hiring practices and salary practices, is going to be more along the line of white middle class Americans. They're going to have this option to move here. Black middle class Americans that might try to move to the suburbs are going to be met with like more resistance than what would have been expected by them or expected by us these days looking back at it. And there's very much that segregation notion that Jim Crow laws have done in the South. This is going to lead to what they call de facto segregation in northern cities, where in the suburbs, just de facto means in reality, the suburbs are very much segregated and there's not much of an African American or any other kind of minority presence that's there. And so what you see are white American suburbs and black American inner city living. And this is more the terminology that gets adopted once you get about a generation or so into this, late 60s, early 70s. The practice of redlining, this is a practice that was taken by some banks when it comes down to guaranteeing and trying to rate the risk factor of loans. They would draw like lines on maps based on property values and loan risk for Americans. And kind of what the term gets to mean is a discriminatory, just try that again, discriminatory home loan practices. Insurance companies would look at neighborhoods like these Levittowns, and if there were minority families that were moving in, they would consider that to be a decline in property value, and so that would be considered a weaker investment risk. And so redlining is something that's going to kind of amplify the distinction on white flight and the distinction between the the lack of ethnic diversity in suburbs when you compare it to in city living. This is a huge trend if you didn't pick up with me kind of, talking about that for the last, 2, 3, 4 minutes. The other big migration trend that's going on is a movement towards the American South and the American West. This region of the country is generally referred to as the Sun Belt, and this is a nice little Wikipedia map that kind of shows us where the Sun Belt is. Spoiler, we're in it in Houston. So this is, a movement of Americans back to the South, not to the rural South, but to a growing, urban area in the South. So cities like Houston and Dallas, Fort Worth, and even Austin and San Antonio. And New Orleans has always been pretty big, but Atlanta, Georgia is kind of like one of the center hubs of this rise of the Sun Belt. And there is some new technology that leads to this movement because by the 1950s, air conditioning technology is more affordable. And so that's letting people kind of make this movement trend. And this is something that's going to continue really into the late 20th into the 21st century. More people kind of moving from the urban north to the south. It's not quite going to get to like a majority moving to the south, but there's this kind of a change of this population settlement pattern that we've seen through the bulk of this class. The real impact on this is going to be the emerging political and economic influence of the southern states. The idea that the Deep South was only agriculture, that's not really going to hold true by the time you get to the 1950s and 60s. And by the time you start looking at things in like decades ahead into the 80s and 90s, more people moving to the South means more political power in the South because more people means more representation in Congress. It also means more representation in the Electoral College. And this is, long story short, this is how California and Texas get to be the two most populous states in the nation. And this is not to downplay the economic influence that still exists in the northeast of the country, but it used to be so completely dominant that the South was kind of an afterthought. But as we get into politics in the 50s and 60s and beyond, well, there's got to be more attention paid to states like California and Texas because of just the huge population boom that's going on in those areas. I know we're talking about politics in here, but this is true in the economic sectors as well. The rise of the Sun Belt is going to lead to a decline in the Rust Belt. This is the term that gets applied in the 70s to the industrial manufacturing centers going from the Great Lakes into the Northeast. Steel City is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This was the Steel Belt in the early part of the 1900s, but this is still the Steel Belt in the 50s, but by the 70s they're calling this the Rust Belt because there's economic stagnation that's going on there. Lots of changes economically speaking, but I do feel like that if you are paying attention, you should be catching some little elements of some familiar territory for the world that we live in the US these days. So thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.